In his classic 1958 book, The Society of Captives, sociologist Gresham M. Sykes discusses what he refers to as the defects of total power. Sykes writes that the power position of correctional officials is not truly infinite, and he acknowledges that prison officials are not free from a system of laws and norms which curb their power. It is noteworthy that Gresham Sykes took note of this point even before the turbulent 1960s, where the U.S. Supreme Court made a number of decisions that granted inmates new rights and civil liberties. Apparently, Sykes realized even before these landmark court decisions that prison officials had limited power. And so far from being omnipotent rulers, he conceded that correctional employees are constantly engaged in a continuous struggle with prisoners to maintain order, and this is a struggle which they often fail. Today, when an inmate violates a prison rule, an officer will write the offender a disciplinary report, or what Gresham Sykes refers to as a charge slip. Interestingly, Sykes argues that a guard cannot turn in a charge slip after charge slip for every violation he encounters. If he does this, it is likely that he will be perceived as being a burden to the top officials of the prison bureaucracy. It is worth noting that Gresham Sykes uses the pronoun he when referring to individuals who are employed as guards within prison settings. The reason for this is that at the time when Sykes was writing and researching his book, which was in the late 1950s, only men were working as correctional officers. Of course, we know today that female correctional officers constitute a substantial percentage of the overall guard workforce. In fact, in states such as Texas, females comprise over 30% of the correctional officer workforce. It is interesting to examine some of the rules which Sykes points out regarding the use of force. For example, he argues that guards are instructed to use their nightsticks on inmates rather than their fists. The reasoning behind this policy, according to Sykes, is that this will set a high threshold on the use of force and will keep officers from casually hitting offenders with their hands. Of course, Sykes also points out that if an officer is working the recreation yard and a riot breaks out, he should throw his nightstick over the wall. The reasoning behind this is that an officer who tries to hold on to his symbol of office during a mass of rebellious inmates may very well find himself beaten to death. In short, Sykes argues that the ability of officials to physically coerce their captives into paths of compliance is something of an illusion. Of course, if you reflect back on James Marquardt's 1986 article titled Doing Research in Prison, you may remember that Marquardt suggested that violence is an effective way of controlling prisoners. While there may be a bit of a discrepancy between the two authors, I think it is worth noting that physical prowess in and of itself is an insufficient way to control offenders. As Gresham Sykes points out, the guard-to-inmate ratio does not allow officers to always apply force since they are so outnumbered. Therefore, as a result, correctional employees may fall back on a system of rewards and punishments. Gresham Sykes provides a particularly interesting account of how low-level guards are often reluctant to enforce the full range of institutional rules and regulations. According to Sykes, the guard frequently fails to report infractions of the rules which have occurred before his eyes. He may also join prisoners in outspoken criticisms of the warden and his assistants. In short, the guard frequently shows evidence of having been corrupted by the captive criminals over whom he stands in theoretical dominance. Take a moment now and refer to the supplemental article for this session titled Preventing Fatal Attractions, Lessons Learned from Inmate Boundary Violators in a Southern Penitentiary System. This article was written by myself, whose name, by the way, is Robert M. Worley, and is co-authored by Richard Tewksbury and Durant Franzen. In this article, my co-authors and I provide suggestions as to how inmate-officer inappropriate relationships can be reduced. You may be surprised to know that it is not altogether unusual for officers to have sexual relationships with the inmates they are paid to supervise. In fact, in this article, we point to a study which suggests that 71 out of every 1,000 inmates may have a willing sexual relationship with a correctional staff member. It should be noted that in situations where the inmate staff sexual misconduct appears to be willing, female staff members tend to be much more likely to be involved. This is probably due in large part to the fact that over 90% of the persons who are incarcerated throughout the nation are men. Given this, there are simply more opportunities for females to form more sexual and romantic relationships with prisoners. So here's my question for you. Should cross-gender supervision be permitted in prison facilities? When Gresham Sykes published his book, The Society of Captives, in 1958, male officers were supervising male offenders. Therefore, there was not really a problem with sexual relationships between guards and inmates. However, in the 21st century, there is an abundance of female correctional officers. Bureau of Justice Statistics data indicate that 26% of correctional officers in state facilities are female, and I would venture to say that this figure is even higher today. There are many issues to consider. For example, if correctional administrators attempt to prevent female officers from working in close proximity to male inmates, there will undoubtedly be grievances and lawsuits from female correctional officers who argue that their promotional opportunities are being restricted due to policies which limit cross-gender supervision. So keeping this in mind, should prison administrators have the authority to restrict cross-gender supervision? And if they attempt to do so, what about the many lawsuits and grievances that they will have to respond to? And more importantly, shouldn't females have the right to work wherever they want? Certainly the majority of female correctional officers do not behave inappropriately with the male inmates they supervise. So why then should all females be punished or restricted from working with male offenders? Currently, at least in Texas and probably in most correctional facilities throughout the United States, a female correctional officer will be assigned to a cell block with male offenders. There may be few, if any, video cameras and plenty of blind spots. While an officer may have the best of intentions, being in close and intimate association with prisoners 8 hours a day over long enough periods of time may make it next to impossible for the officer to maintain a sense of social distance between themselves and the inmates they are paid to supervise. Consider, if you will, the 2013 scandal in the Baltimore City Detention Center, where an inmate gang leader had sexual relations with several female guards and even fathered children with 4 of these female jailers. Also, there are reports which suggest that many of the male inmate prison gang members within the Baltimore City Detention Center would frequently have champagne and seafood dinners with their female captors. One inmate even allowed a female guard to drive to and from work in his Mercedes-Benz convertible. There was obviously a culture of corruption within the Baltimore City Detention Center. In this recent case, several female guards were suspected of smuggling in drugs and cell phones and having sexual relationships with offenders. But I would submit to you that inappropriate relationships between staff and inmates go on in virtually every correctional facility throughout the United States. I have personally conducted qualitative and quantitative research which confirms this. So again, the question is, what can correctional administrators do to prevent inappropriate relationships from forming? Obviously, administrators cannot idly sit back and watch as these relationships unfold. It would certainly not be conducive to inmate rehabilitation. If an inmate is permitted to have access to drugs, casual sex, and cell phones to commit crimes from behind the prison walls, how can we be expected to see him be sent back into society a changed person? And even if we assume that prisons cannot rehabilitate offenders, scholars who favor just desserts and deterrence correctional philosophies might argue that any punishment an inmate receives will be meaningless if a male inmate is permitted to have seafood dinners, champagne, and sexual liaisons with female employees. This does not really sound like punishment. Rather, it sounds like an episode from the popular reality television show The Bachelor. So again, what can we do about this? I think it is worth pointing out that Gresham Sykes argues in his classic book that prison guards may feel pressured by inmates to be nice or to be a good Joe. If a guard is perceived as having a rigid adherence to the rules, he or she may be viewed by inmates as being either an object of ridicule or be met with outright hostility. Sykes also makes an important point regarding the issue of reciprocity. As he notes in his book, the guard is dependent on inmates for the satisfactory performance of his duties. A troublesome, noisy, dirty cell block reflects upon a guard's abilities to handle the prisoners. Therefore, a guard may make deals or trades with the prisoners where compliance or obedience is won in certain areas at the cost of tolerating disobedience elsewhere. Sykes refers to this practice as winning compliance where it counts. Gresham Sykes also provides an in-depth discussion of what he refers to as the pains of imprisonment. From the moment an inmate enters the prison cell, he is given a uniform and told what to do. When Sykes was researching his book, he noted that the heads of each inmate was shaved upon their arrival at the New Jersey State Prison. Western culture has long placed a peculiar emphasis on shaving the head as a symbol of degradation, ranging from the enraged treatment of collaborators in occupied Europe to the more measured barbering of recruits in the armed forces. Often, prison administrators argue that inmates' heads are shaven due to the concerns of cleanliness, neatness, and sanitation issues. While this may be partially true, it is also a control issue. The inmate who has his hair cut shortly learns fairly quickly that he has little control over anything, including his own appearance. And while he will not go hungry, and while he's going to be given adequate medical care, the inmate will be stripped away of any material possessions. In modern Western culture, material possessions are so large a part of an individual's conception of self that to be stripped of these is to the equivalent to attacking psychological sense of well-being in the individual. And we know that the vast majority of male inmates in the U.S. are figuratively castrated by being forced into involuntary celibacy. Today, only 5 states, California, Connecticut, New Mexico, New York, and Washington, permit inmates to have conjugal visits. In his book, Gresham Sykes points out that Latin American countries permit inmates to have conjugal visits, by and large. He argues that because male inmates are forced into celibacy, their status as a male is constantly being called into question. He also argues that as many as 35% of male prisoners may engage in certain types of sexual acts with other male prisoners. Today, the Prison Rape Elimination Act of 2003 requires the Bureau of Justice of Statistics to collect data on sexual assaults as well as other sexual acts between inmates and between correctional staff and inmates. If you read the article, Preventing Fatal Attractions, which again was written by myself, Robert Worley, as well as my 2 co-authors, Richard Tewksbury and Durant Franzen, you will notice that we recommend that correctional administrators should provide inmates with certain tools to cultivate relationships they have on the outside. I think it may be especially important to give inmates tools such as conjugal visits to maintain and preserve romantic relationships they have in the outside world. Of course, whenever this is done, it raises all types of new questions and concerns for correctional administrators. For example, should correctional administrators only allow married inmates to have conjugal visits? If so, the vast majority of inmates will be excluded from having a conjugal visit since most inmates are not married. As you read through the material for this week, consider what else can be done by correctional administrators to reduce incidents of both inmate-on-inmate sexual contact and inmate-in-staff sexual contact. Gresham Sykes was writing at a time when female officers were by and large excluded from working in close proximity with male offenders. Nevertheless, I would submit to you that many of these observations and insights he makes regarding officer misconduct are fairly accurate. The fact is that ever since there have been prisons, guards have been under strong pressure by inmates to make compromises. But consider, if you will, how the presence of female officers has changed the dynamics of prisons since the publication of Sykes' book, The Society of Captives. What do you suppose Gresham Sykes would have to say about female officers working within male prisons? The fact is, we really don't know what he'd say, because Gresham Sykes was writing at a time when this practice simply did not occur. Would he argue that the presence of female officers produces a calming effect on male inmates? Or might Sykes argue that male inmates may be motivated to establish sexual relationships with female officers in an attempt to ease one of the major pains of imprisonment? Consider these questions as well as other issues that relate to the topic at hand as you reflect upon the readings for this discussion session.